Hey friends, welcome to worship once again. We are in week 3 of Lent. We're continuing our series, Short Stories with Jesus, looking at what the parables mean for us today. And today we have our first parable from Mark's Gospel, although it's recorded in all 3 of the synoptics. If you want to follow along, I would invite you to turn or open your app to Mark chapter 4 and just sort of hold that spot. We'll talk about a little bit of what Jesus says later on, but let's begin just by diving in and hearing these words. This is 4 verses 1 through 9. Again, Jesus began to teach beside the sea. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the sea, and he sat there while the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. He began to teach them many things in parables, and in his teaching he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as they sowed, some seed fell upon the path, and birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed still fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it out, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And Jesus said to them, "Let anyone with ears to hear listen." May God add blessing to our reading and understanding of this. So this is maybe a familiar parable for you. As I mentioned, it's in all 3 of the synoptic gospels. The usual way of understanding this text is actually provided in each of the Gospels by Jesus himself. Later on, he's talking to his disciples and to a more private group, and they sort of ask what it means, and he says to them, "Do you not understand this parable? If you don't understand this, how will you understand others? The sower sows the word. These are the ones on the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that's sown in them. And these are the ones sown on rocky ground. When they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy, but they have no root and endure only for a while. Then when trouble and persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are those sown among the thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth and the desire of things come in and choke out the word, and it yields nothing. And these are the ones sown on the good soil. They hear the word and accept it and bear fruit 30 and 60 and 100-fold. That's the most traditional understanding, is that there are different folks who are differently receptive to the word, to what Jesus has to share. And that's one way to understand it, most certainly. That's what Jesus provides as his commentary. That's what all the gospel writers provide as a meaning. And there's plenty of good reflections relevant to our lives that could be mined out of this. Another way to consider this same idea would be to ask where and how and in what ways the seeds of grace and love and mercy have been sowed in us at various seasons in our life. And in what ways for you did they take root? In what ways for you did they fail to take root? And in what seasons was that true? Ellsworth Collis talks about it in this view. In essence, each of us in different seasons are like various kinds of soil, or perhaps at a given time, each one of us would have various kinds of this soil within us. Maybe we're open at church, but we're path-worn when we're at work. Maybe we're excitable and responsive when we are with our families, but we're distracted by the lure of wealth and other things when we're with our friends. There's all sorts of examples like this. He says maybe each one of us, either in different seasons or all at once, has all of these things. And when the seed, when the good news, when the joy and the grace and the love of God comes to us, our receptiveness is dependent upon the moment. This is also a very worthwhile way of reading this text. And we could tease much out of it for our lives today. But as I was reading this text this week, I kept coming back to the character, the one character in the parable proper, the sower. And so I want you to imagine, what is she like? What does he look like as he goes and sows the seed? Does she sing? Does she hum as she's out in a field? What's the field look like where this sower is? What kind of seed are they trying to grow? What's the surrounding? Jesus tells this story to give us a vivid image. What's the image that comes to your mind? What does that sower look like? Is it a man, a woman? Are you sure? What's the field look like? What's the seed look like? This is what I kept thinking about this week, and this is what I want us to sort of play with as an idea. I think there's a lot for us to unpack here. I'll tell you what the sower looks like to me, or rather who the sower looks like to me. The sower reminds me of Jeff. Reminds me of Pastor Jeff up in the Detroit area, riding through the Redford community in his golf cart. He used to ride it from the parsonage where he lived with his family to the church. Redford is a very blue-collar community. The houses there were just built as just larger than tiny houses before tiny houses were something that people did on purpose. And they were definitely built to be temporary housing for factory workers moving to Detroit in the automobile boom. Now these 60 years later, longer, they're still occupied by people who work in industry there. Jeff used to tell me that there was nothing as disarming as a big man in a golf cart. And then he would look at me and he would smile and he said, well, maybe the two of us big guys in a golf cart. And so he would go back and forth that route and he would lean out to wave to people, to say hello. He would give people a high five or stop and talk to them. He would ask how their dog or their cat or their mother or their son was. He would do this back and forth. And I'll tell you what, it is pretty disarming. In the church, he had posted signs of a phrase that he became famous for. And me and some of my friends have quoted him all across the country. God loves you and there's nothing you can do about it. And man, he believed that and he lived that. He would share that with people whether they wanted to hear it or not. On one ride on the golf cart, we got a single finger wave from one older lady. Jeff told me that she didn't really like his energy and how happy he was. And he said he sort of understood because she'd had a hard life. That never stopped him from waving and saying good morning and calling her by name while she sat on her porch and smoked. He'd do it again when he went home in the afternoon, back and forth on his golf cart. When I think of this sower, I think of Jeff. The sower reminds me of Jeff because, well, by today's standards, the sower didn't really seem to be especially efficient at the work that they were doing. They didn't seem to be real efficient at their agricultural job. You would think if seeds and time are a commodity with limits on both, then you'd want to be precise and accurate with the placement of that seed. I know this, not because I know anything about agricultural development and planting seeds, though I can tell you a lot about grass seed. I know this because I listen to K-State sports on the radio, and when I do, I learn all about all of the industry that helps people put the seeds in the right spot so that we can grow food and feed ourselves and the world. The sower is spilling seeds all over the place. Pastor Jeff didn't seem to be too concerned about who he was sharing grace with. The finger-wagging woman, the guys who were smoking something besides cigarettes in their front yard, the long-term saints of the church and the new family that moved in down the street. He didn't seem to mind sharing it with factory workers and people who just wished that they would have any kind of work at all to make a living. He did it with the parents of his kids' friends at various activities and with guys at the bar. Perhaps the invitation of this parable is for us to be a little bit less discriminate with who it is that we're willing to share the kingdom of God with, the grace of God, the mercy of God. Who is it that we're willing to share a bit of ourselves with, our time, our energy, our focus? I mean, I think about Jesus. One of the greatest gifts that he gave to people is that he saw them. And I think about how I live my life, and my guess is that many of you live your lives, and sometimes we hardly notice the people who are around us. I think one of the challenges of this text is to say, what if we just share the seed with everyone? Whatever the good news is, whatever the word, whatever the grace, whatever the energy, the love, the compassion of God is, what if we just shared that on the path, on the good soil, among the thorns, wherever it went? Perhaps we don't have to make the most perfect or the most surefire strategic bet. Maybe every investment doesn't have to yield fantastic return. Maybe sharing love is good enough by itself. Maybe we could be a little bit less selfish with how it is that we give of ourselves to other people. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean the unhoused people that we walk by hardly even noticing from time to time. I mean the coworker who, if we're being honest, is insufferable. and yet deserves to be recognized and to be noticed and to have their humanity, the very image of God within them, recognized and affirmed, and their voice to be heard. I mean, the people who we've decided are out, either because they're in the wrong political party or persuasion, those of different faiths or no faith at all, those who have been convicted of crime or who don't speak English up to our standards, the pregnant teen and the government-supported family, those who we deem to be too lazy or too fat or too unresourceful to be worth our investment, the fast food workers and minimum wage employees that surround us in the places that we go, the grocery store, the restaurants all around us, and yet we hardly ever take notice of. I mean, the people that we just ignore because we've busied ourselves so much that we've hardly left any room for loving people who are around us. We've hardly left any room for acknowledging another's humanity. I look at Pastor Jeff and I look at the sower, and what I see in both of them is a delightful, joy-filled persona that is overflowing, that is just exuding God's grace. Pastor Jeff is not only a big guy in a golf cart, he also has a larger-than-life persona, and he has an energy and a grace and a love inspired by God to match it. I see in both of these two characters indiscriminate reflection of God's goodness, because after all, God loves you and there's nothing that you can do about it. I imagine our sower with baskets hanging around them that are filled with seed, that are supposed to go out into the field, and yet every step that the sower takes, maybe a little skip in their step, maybe a little humming, maybe some of the same overtones as that woman in her house baking the 60 pounds of flour. Every step the sower takes, just seeds falling out of the basket. And a little chuckle, oh, here's some, there's some. Everywhere's some. I wonder if we could live more like that. If we could just not worry about whether some of the grace and the gift and the love and the energy and the humanity that we have is shared with somebody who's undeserving or who won't appreciate it enough. If we worried less about making sure that all of our investments were good investments as far as time and energy and particularly love and grace were concerned. And what if we just decided to love everybody instead? And maybe we've missed a point when we talk about grace. If we want to think about this seed as sharing grace or reflecting God's love with other people, maybe we've come to think, like I said earlier with the sower, that grace is some sort of commodity that's limited. Perhaps the sower knows, perhaps my friend Jeff knows, that God's grace is a bottomless well and there is always more. So it's always worth sharing it. And the impact that it will make on others, it's always worth a try, even if it's not a sure thing. You know, Jesus lived like this in his day-to-day life. He attracted people to him who weren't safe bets. They weren't the straight-A students. They weren't the ones that everybody else looked up to. If you were starting a movement to turn the world upside down, this probably isn't the cast of characters that you would draw together. But I'm not even just talking about the disciples. I'm talking about the fact that he invested the same good energy in his disciples and in religious elites and in random people that he met on the street, and women and children and adults and those with wealth and those without, that Jesus seems to be pretty indiscriminate with how he shared his love and his grace. Couple stories came to mind, specifically the Gerasene demoniac and the woman at the well. Both of those people who are may well be cast out of society for things beyond their control. And Jesus looks at them and says, hey, I've got good news with you, and I'm going to turn and make you be evangelists. And both of them, in their own stories, become some of the first evangelists to share the good news of Jesus and his transformative power with the world. That's not who you would have picked if you were starting a movement. Jesus heals pretty openly to foreigners, to women, to children who have died, even to those related to their occupiers. I've met another person who's sort of like this. He's my friend Bob Goff. And I'm reading a daily devotion written by him this year called Live in Grace and Walk in Love. And that's pretty much his philosophy in life. And he embodies it. And he has that same joy-filled energy and that same reflection of God's grace and way too much energy to be contained in a room. He encourages us, me, in this book with phrases like this: quit waiting for a plan and just go love everybody. And perhaps some of us need to make our faith just a little bit simpler. Or if you find yourself choosing between the plans that you have and loving others, go with the sure thing and choose love. That's in a chapter that says plans work or they don't. Love always works. Go with the sure thing. Later he talks about the amoeba that is young kids playing baseball. You know what I'm talking about. It's just a complete mess, and we love it and we cheer them on when we're at our best. And he talks about God's love being like that for us. Whether we get it right or not, God loves us. He said that God never told us success meant big accomplishments, but instead it meant simply living in grace and walking in love. And it got me thinking, what if Bob and what if Jeff and what if Jesus and what if the sower and what if this parable are all inviting us to perhaps redefine what success is, to redefine how it is that we spend our energy, how it is that we share God's grace and reflect love, who it is that we invest in, who's worthy of our seeds of love and compassion. What if we allow all of these things to redefine that for us? What if part of the story was to stop focusing so much on outcomes and instead start focusing on what we can control? And friends, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't celebrate the places where growth happens 30 and 60 and 100-fold. We absolutely should. But what if we define the essence of our faith and our life not about the outcomes, but about the energy that was shared? The effort that was put in, the willingness to see other people. Jesus defined much of his ministry like that. What if we let the seeds of grace fall from us every step of the way and trusted that God might be the one who provides the growth, even in the most unlikely of people? One last thought from Bob, talking about our body's uncanny ability to act without thought or conscious awareness when we develop habits. He suggests that perhaps our spirits work the same way. And he says that when joy is a habit, love is a reflex. I love that. Perhaps that's our invitation for today. Maybe in your life, an errant seed, a seed that was sown in a time where your soil wasn't particularly receptive to whatever God was doing, to whatever transformation you needed in your life. Maybe some seed that was sown in that time came to fruition many years later. And maybe you can look back and say it's because of what my grandparent or my mother or my teacher said when I was a child that I finally made peace with this part of who I am or this part of my experience. When were you not the receptive type of soil? Maybe it was this week. You got yourself too much in a hurry. That happened to me. And I sort of stopped paying attention to what was going on around me. And how is it that the seed that was planted in that time might be growing to grace in its own season and time? When was it that you did that for somebody else? You saw somebody who had a tough exterior and you decided to love them anyway, and maybe you ended up with a good friend. Perhaps you've benefited from somebody else's act of generosity, and not only did you receive that, but then you also decided to similarly invest in people around you. When and where has that happened in your life? That seed has fallen on some less than ideal soil and yet produced something fruitful nonetheless. When Jeff wasn't riding the streets of Redford, he was in the next neighborhood closer to downtown Detroit, Brightmoor. Now, Redford wasn't exactly a thriving suburban place, but Brightmoor was a pretty rough place. At one point, there was a lot of people who had moved out and most of the houses were empty. There was a fair amount of violence. People from the city, and most especially from further out in the suburbs, would come and dump things in their neighborhood. I mean, like tires, refrigerators. That's how people outside the community viewed that community. as just a neighborhood to dump things in. There were some houses that had caught fire. And what eventually happened is that some people got together and decided to invest in their community. And they decided to make a difference. And friends, the work that was happening there was absolutely incredible. I had a chance a few times to spend some time there. I had a chance to take a group of high school students there in what was one of the most impactful mission trips that I've ever been a part of. It was beautiful. And the transformation was continuing to happen. I got to see it over the years. Streets were cleaned up, one tire at a time, People dealing in shady businesses began to move one block at a time further and further out of the neighborhood. I was a beneficiary of the work of a youth group / rap choir and a performance that they did. I got to help in the free store that they did. I got to see the way that murals had been painted on houses that had been burned out. And we got to create a mural at the church in Brightmoor that had become a mission center, that had become a hub for work, similar to what happens at the Center of Grace on a smaller scale. I met stubborn people who finally were the ones who said that they refused to let their neighborhood go this direction and began to reclaim it. I met a guy who moved into an abandoned home, just decided that he would take care of it and had like 6 lots of this ginormous community garden, this urban garden that was producing food more than most of the community could eat. And there was community gardens all over the place. It wasn't easy work. And when it began, it was a pretty fringe idea. A community that had been decimated by depopulation and by recession. A community that was really a bellwether for the struggles of their entire metropolitan area. A place where hopelessness abounded, without the ability to generate big resources to bring money into it. A place where some folks up to no good seemed to run the streets at one time. Began to turn around, and there were break-ins and run-ins and hang-ups along the way. There were fast starts and restarts and misstarts and mistakes. But there was also a persistence from the people of the community, from people like Jeff who invested in the community. And friends, what I saw was absolutely beautiful. None of this would have happened if people were only investing, only willing to put energy and effort into a surefire bet, because this community was anything but that. None of this would have happened if people insisted on being confident that their investment would yield good results, however it is that you defined it. The numbers and the odds were not stacked in their favor, and yet they seemed willing to sow those seeds anyway. In the rocky path, and the thorns, and the shallow soil. And by God's grace, it grew up. Not every neighborhood revitalization is a Brightmoor. But I'll tell you that I think every neighborhood revitalization is a worthwhile effort. Perhaps this is for us a reminder that when others say that this isn't the project to bother with, when this isn't a person who's worth our effort or our attention or our acknowledgement, when spending time there is just spending good energy after bad, perhaps it's a reminder that when other people say that this isn't the right place to plant a garden, we do it anyway. Maybe not every time, maybe sometimes. Maybe we do well to remember that we can only plant gardens in the places that we are. We can only plant seeds within the people that we interact with. We can only share good news with the folks that we pass by every single day. And who knows what will become of whatever is planted. So maybe a way to read this parable is to ask ourselves how we can be more like the sower, spreading seed on all the ground and trusting God will give it growth. So with whom and where and in what ways and how do you need to sow the seeds of grace this week? Let's take a few moments for reflection.